Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner is an interesting example of a poem that problematizes the relationships between what we've been calling Romanticism and the Gothic. On the one hand, the poem appears in lyrical ballads and is in fact the opening poem in the 1798 version, and thus seems to be encompassed by Wordsworth's theoretical defense of subject matter and style that does not fit conventional expectations of the 18th century. On the other hand, it's a poem that became a bit of an embarrassment for Wordsworth, since the reviewers were particularly harsh in their criticism of this poem. So he relegates it to the middle of the book in the 1800 edition, so as to give it a less prominent place. Coleridge, as we've seen, would later say that he and Wordsworth had agreed that Wordsworth would write poems on natural subjects, while Coleridge would write about supernatural subject matter. If they did indeed agree on this, Wordsworth clearly became quite embarrassed by it and tried to minimize and rationalize the role of the supernatural in lyrical ballads. Moreover, in terms of content, the poem seems very much divided between its moralizing tendencies and its fantastical events, which often hardly seem reducible to the moral provided. And this may have been somewhat embarrassing to Coleridge as well, since he added the marginal gloss that is printed in your text to the poem in 1817, 20 years later. It's as if he wants to make absolutely clear that there is a moral lesson to be drawn from this poem. But of course, it did not have this gloss when it was originally published in 1798. So, like Wordsworth, Coleridge is in a somewhat conflicted position in relation to the Gothic. On the one hand, he indulges in strange, dark fantasies that he knows are popular with a wide readership, and on the other hand, he wants to be seen as writing something more morally edifying. Another significant difference from Wordsworth's poems is that while Wordsworth's lyrical ballads are quite often lyrical, Coleridge's poem very much takes the form of a ballad. It's a long narrative poem in ballad stanzas with ballad meter, with just a few exceptions of extended stanzas. And he uses deliberately archaic diction. They did not talk like this in Coleridge's time, which is in imitation of ancient ballads. So that also ties in with the Gothic fascination with the past. It also aids in Coleridge's positioning of the mariner in relation to his personal pronouns. The impersonality of the poem's opening, it is an ancient mariner, which is reversed by the end of part one with the directness of I shot the albatross, which is the first use of I in the poem, the first indication of agency. It is the mariner takes responsibility in that last line of part one. Later, when he's working with the dead sailors, he says, "We were a ghastly crew." He associates himself with the Gothic phenomenon of the living dead. So his moral and spiritual state makes him one of them. He recognizes that he belongs with them. Perhaps the first question we should ask about this poem is, does it follow a kind of consistent logic? Does it make sense the way events unfold? Or do things just seem to happen randomly? We can see this in the connection between trauma and narrative. Why does the narrator tell his tale? Why does the narrator pick out this particular wedding guest? He stoppeth one of three. Why does he stop that one? The mariner himself doesn't seem to understand it. At the end of the poem, he claims, that moment that his face I see, I know the man who must hear me. To him my tale I teach. And this is one of the extended stanzas, which disrupts the ballad meter. So the point here is that the mariner's tale is one of compulsion. He needs to tell the wedding guest this story. As he describes it at the end, his penance is not done. Every now and then he needs to relate his tale. So there's something of compulsion in the narrator's telling, but also in the wedding guest's listening. The end of the fourth stanza, the mariner hath his will. The wedding guest sat on a stone. He cannot choose but hear. A line that is repeated a little later. The wedding guest, he beat his breast, yet he cannot choose but hear. Is it significant also that the mariner stops the guest on the way to a wedding? A wedding typically symbolizes the connection of community. And he prevents the guest from encountering that community. And by the end of the poem, he kind of challenges the idea of what that community should be. Oh, sweeter than the marriage feast, 'tis sweeter far to me to walk together to the kirk with a goodly company. Going to church together is more important than going to a feast together. So there's the Christian message is in play there. In terms of the poem's narrative, we basically have the mariner killing the albatross and having to expiate that crime. But what's the big deal about this? Sailors probably shoot birds all the time, so why does the mariner have to pay such a significant price for what he does? Part of that seems to come from what the albatross represents in terms of the unity of life. At length did cross an albatross, through the fog it came, as if it had been a Christian soul, we hailed it in God's name. So again, we have the Christian association that the albatross has, but also it is hailed as if it is a friend, a fellow being. And we might compare this also to Wordsworth's feelings of guilt, that when he violates nature's law, he, as in the prelude, we see him representing his guilt as significant. Nature is also present in other forms, even the quite horrible ones. The very deeps did rot, O Christ, that ever this should be. Yea, slimy things did crawl with legs upon the slimy sea. This stanza is very much the mariner's experience of abjection. He is surrounded by living creatures that disgust him, that he does not want to have anything to do with, and yet he is connected to. And only when he blesses them does the curse start to become undone. In other words, only once he accepts that which he tries to throw off from himself, his kinship of this bare feeling of life with other things, only then can he start to heal. So if his crime was in asserting mastery over nature, he needs to incorporate it into himself in order to heal himself. And this is significant later when he blesses the water snakes. We're told, "Sure, my kind saint took pity on me, and I blessed them unaware," which is a significant question. Don't you have to consciously bless something? All of this starts to point to the tension between the Christian moral of the poem and the seeming arbitrariness of the world of the poem. And here we might look at the function of the marginal glosses that Coleridge added 20 years later. Does this gloss actually explain anything about the poem, or does it confuse things all the more? We're told things like the albatross begins to be avenged, or the curse is finally expiated. But the marginal gloss adds to the poem a conventional moral interpretation, judgmental adjectives that tend to divide the poem into good and evil, but it still doesn't fully explain everything. So the relationship between the Christian moral drawn by the mariner and later by the gloss writer seems to be belied by the seeming arbitrariness of the universe. Why, for example, does the rest of the crew drop dead while the mariner lives on? Does it have to? Is that random, or does it have to do with their different attitudes? For example, the crew says, "For all averred, I had killed the bird that made the breeze to blow. Wretch, said they, the bird to slay that made the breeze to blow." But then in the following stanza, "'Twas right that said they such birds to slay that bring the fog and mist." So here the mariner has perhaps an innate feeling of guilt, while the crew only judge by the consequences of the act and not its moral significance. Alternatively, we could see it that the mariner is doomed to continue his earthly sufferings, while the dead sailors simply become a seraph band and seem to ascend to heaven in part 6. But also, we're told in the gloss that life in death wins his soul in a game of dice, which makes the event seem much more random, the role of chance in ordering the universe. Dicing for the mariner recalls the Christian image of the soldiers dicing for Christ's clothes at the foot of the cross, but the dice are also an image of the universe as being arbitrarily ordered and not necessarily divinely ordered. And finally, the mariner wants the hermit to shrive his soul, which is a conventionally Christian desire, yet both the hermit and the pilot experience the mariner as a Gothic phenomenon, and the wedding guest as well thinks that he may be a spirit, a ghost. So, to sum up this poem, then, we need to ask whether the mariner's moral really serves to explain what happens in the poem, or do we get the sense that events are much more arbitrary than he is explaining them to be? He prayeth best who loveth best all things, both great and small, for the dear God who loveth us, he made and loveth all. Which is a fairly conventional moral, very much in keeping with Wordsworth's morals in other lyrical ballads. But we end not with the mariner's moral, but with the effect of the story on the wedding guest. A sadder and a wiser man he rose the morrow morn. So if the poem is meant to communicate a Christian message, why do we see it making the wedding guest sadder and wiser? Moreover, the wedding guest doesn't go to the wedding, so the knowledge that the mariner imparts to him seems to be a divisive kind of knowledge rather than one that reintegrates the community in some way. So has the wedding guest learned some deep and important knowledge about the nature of life, or has the mariner simply used him to satisfy his own burning need to tell the tale? Has anything productive been accomplished at all? We might argue then that we end not with a Christian sense of redemption, but with a much more equivocal form of wisdom, a recognition perhaps of the darker side of life.